The house I grew up in was a modest two-story affair, tucked away in a sleepy suburb, the kind of place where the past seemed to linger in the air, holding its breath, just as we did on humid summer afternoons. Our family home stood at the end of a winding cul-de-sac, embraced by aging oaks that whispered secrets to the wind. It was a place that had witnessed 1,000 sunsets, each one painting the facade in hues of nostalgia. The porch swing creaked with memories, and the floorboards sang the songs of our footsteps, a symphony of domestic life. My younger brother Matty and I shared many adventures there, the sort of innocent escapades one might expect from a pair of children with wild imaginations. Matty, with his unruly brown hair and eyes that seemed to hold the entire universe, was always the dreamer. He was 4 years younger than me, and his presence was like a shadow that danced to its own rhythm, always a step behind, yet sometimes inexplicably ahead. Our days were filled with the typical chaos of childhood: mud pies, imaginary monsters, and the occasional quarrel over which TV show to watch. It was on an ordinary afternoon that I first noticed something amiss. The sun was beginning to dip below the trees, casting long shadows across the floor of our shared bedroom. Matty was sitting cross-legged on his bed, his back to me, his attention firmly fixed on something I couldn't see. At first, I thought he might be absorbed in one of his many toys, but as I approached, I realized he was talking in a low, conspiratorial whisper. "Who are you talking to, Matty?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. He didn't turn around. "My friend," I chuckled, assuming he meant an imaginary companion. We had always been encouraged to explore our imaginations, but something about the way Matty remained so focused made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. "What's your friend's name?" I ventured, trying to peer over his shoulder. Matty finally turned to face me, his eyes wide and bright. "He doesn't have a name," he said simply, as if that explained everything. Over the next few weeks, Matty's strange behavior shifted from a curiosity to a concern. He spent more time alone, whispering to this invisible friend, and often I would catch snippets of his murmurings, fragmented words that seemed to carry a peculiar weight. At night, I would hear him speaking in hushed tones, the cadence of his voice rising and falling like the tide, lulling me into a restless sleep. I began to wonder if it was just a phase, a product of his imagination running wild. Yet, there was something insistent and unsettling about it, an undercurrent of intensity that belied the innocence of a child's game. I tried talking to our parents about Matty's new friend, but they dismissed it as harmless fun, a boy's invention to stave off the boredom of lazy summer days. Then came the day when things began to escalate in earnest. I was in the kitchen, helping Mom with dinner, when I heard Matty's voice echoing from the living room. He was louder than usual, his words punctuated by pauses, as though he were listening intently to responses only he could hear. Curious, I left the kitchen, wiping my hands on a dish towel as I went. I found Matty standing in front of the fireplace, his expression animated, his hands gesturing wildly in conversation. I hesitated at the threshold, an inexplicable chill wrapping around my spine. "Maddie, what's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He turned to look at me, his face flushed with excitement. "We're playing a game," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "What kind of game?" He shrugged and turned back to the fireplace. "You wouldn't understand," he whispered, more to himself than to me. I watched him for a moment longer, a knot forming in my stomach. It was as if he were caught in a web, invisible threads holding him in thrall to something profoundly beyond my grasp. I thought about telling Mom and Dad again, but something held me back. Maybe it was the fear of being dismissed, or perhaps it was a deeper unspoken worry that acknowledging the strangeness would somehow make it more real. Night fell, casting the house in a cloak of shadows. Dinner was a quiet affair, with Maddie uncharacteristically subdued, his gaze flicking to the window every so often. After we had eaten, we retreated to our rooms, and I lay awake in bed, my mind churning with thoughts I couldn't quite articulate. Sometime in the early hours, I awoke to the sound of Maddie's voice. It was a soft, insistent murmur, the kind that gnaws at the edges of sleep, pulling you inexorably into wakefulness. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and listened. His voice was clearer now, as if he were standing right beside me, though I could see his silhouette still sitting on his bed, outlined by the dim glow of the nightlight. "Maddie," I whispered, "are you okay?" He didn't respond, didn't even shift. The air felt heavy, charged with a tension I couldn't name. I slipped out of bed and padded over to him, my heart beating in my throat. As I drew closer, I realized he was staring at the wall, his eyes unfocused, yet intent. Before I could say anything, he spoke, his voice eerie in the stillness. He says you shouldn't worry. He's always been here. A shiver crawled up my spine. Who are you talking about? Maddie blinked slowly, his gaze shifting to meet mine. In that moment, there was a gravity to his eyes that seemed far beyond his years. "He's my friend," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what to say. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to take him in my arms, to shield him from whatever unseen force had ensnared him. But instead, I found myself backing away, retreating to my own bed, where I lay rigid, sleep eluding me. Days passed, each one bringing with it a subtle intensification of the inexplicable tension that hung over our home. Maddie grew more withdrawn, his interactions with the world around him increasingly eclipsed by his interactions with his invisible companion. I tried to engage him, to draw him out with games and distractions, but it was as if a part of him had slipped into a realm I couldn't reach. The climax came one evening, just as the last light of the day was fading. I was in our room, reading a book, when I heard it. A faint tapping, rhythmic and insistent. I looked up, my eyes scanning the room, searching for the source. Maddie was sitting cross-legged on his bed, his head cocked to one side, listening. "What's that sound?" I asked, my voice sounding small and distant. Maddie didn't answer. He seemed entranced, his eyes glued to the window. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, echoing in the silence like the pulse of a hidden heart. I stood, my feet carrying me to the window, despite the cold dread that wrapped around my limbs. The backyard stretched out beneath a canopy of stars, tranquil and undisturbed. Yet the tapping continued, steady and inexorable. "Maddie, do you hear that?" I whispered, my breath fogging the glass. He nodded, his expression one of serene understanding. "It's him," he said simply. A shadow crept across my vision, a flicker at the edge of sight. I blinked, trying to dispel the illusion, but it remained, a shapeless presence hovering just beyond the window. My heart thundered in my chest, my mind flailing for rational explanations, even as my instincts screamed that there was something profoundly wrong. The shadow shifted, resolving into a vague outline that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. I took a step back, my legs trembling as I clutched the windowsill for support. "Maddie, come away from the window," I urged, my voice shaking. But Maddie remained where he was, his gaze locked onto the figure outside. He looked at peace, a serene smile curving his lips. "It's okay," he murmured, as if comforting a frightened animal. "He's not here to hurt us." I felt the world tilt, reality blurring at the edges as the shadow grew, its presence filling the room with a suffocating weight. I wanted to run, to flee from whatever malevolent force had seeped into our lives. But I was rooted to the spot, my heart pounding a frantic tattoo against my ribs. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the shadow receded, drawing back into the night, leaving behind only the echo of its presence and the whisper of the wind through the trees. The tapping ceased, the air clearing as though a storm had passed, leaving the room in a charged silence. Maddie blinked, his expression clearing as he turned to me with a small, apologetic smile. "He's gone now," he said, a hint of sadness in his voice. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my knees weak and unsteady. "Maddie, who was that?" I asked, my voice trembling with the remnants of fear. He shrugged, his shoulders rising and falling, with a child's acceptance of the inexplicable. "Just my friend," he repeated, as if it were the simplest truth. In the days that followed, Maddie's interactions with his invisible friend began to wane. He seemed more present, more himself, as the oppressive atmosphere that had gripped our home slowly lifted. I kept a wary eye on him, half expecting the shadow to return, but it never did. The house settled back into its familiar rhythms, the memories of those strange occurrences fading like mist in the morning sun. Yet, even as life resumed its normalcy, a lingering fear clung to me, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind that refused to be silenced. I often found myself watching Maddie, searching for signs that the shadow might still linger, hidden in the corners of his mind. He seemed unchanged, his laughter as bright and infectious as ever, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. I never spoke of the shadow to anyone, not even Maddie. It became our silent secret, a shared experience that bound us together in a way nothing else could. As the years passed, I hoped that time would smooth the edges of that memory, rendering it less sharp, less potent. But even now, when the wind whispers through the trees and the shadows stretch long and dark, I find myself listening for the tap-tap-tapping, a reminder of a friend that might still be watching from the other side of the glass. The day began with an ordinary hum of life in the suburbs. Sunlight filtered gently through the curtains, casting a warm, inviting glow over the breakfast table. I watched my son, James, engrossed in arranging his cereal into meticulous patterns, his small fingers moving with a deliberate patience that always seemed beyond his years. At 10, James had an introspective nature, often lost in his own world, but keenly observant of the one around him. Our lives were painted in shades of routine comfort, with the gentle monotony breaking only for the odd family outing or school event. James attended a local elementary school and was generally well-liked, though often described as a bit peculiar by his teachers. They would speak of his impressive academic abilities, quickly followed by a hesitant mention of his solitary tendencies. As his mother, I found these characteristics endearing, though I sometimes worried about the depth of his solitude. It wasn't until one crisp autumn afternoon that the fabric of our predictable life began to unravel. James had returned from school unusually quiet, and while his silence was not unusual, there was an air of disquiet about him that I could not shake. He sat on the living room floor, sketching intently in his notebook. I peered over his shoulder, half expecting to see the usual mishmash of doodles and mathematical problems, but instead found a series of intricate maps. "What's this, sweetheart?" I asked, brushing my fingers gently through his hair. "It's our house," he replied, not looking up from his work. "But different." His answer piqued my curiosity. The maps were detailed, yet they showed rooms and corridors that didn't exist in our modest home. Hallways that twisted and turned, leading to hidden chambers and secret doors. I felt a chill, as if a draft had swept through the room. I shook it off, attributing it to the imaginative mind of a child. "Are these secret rooms, James?" I smiled, trying to keep the tone light. He nodded, his eyes still fixed on the page. "I found them," he said simply. "Found them?" I repeated, confused. He paused, his pencil hovering above the paper. "I go there sometimes, when I'm alone." The casualness of his statement sent a shiver down my spine. I laughed it off, ruffling his hair. "Well, maybe you can show me someday." His eyes met mine briefly, a solemnity in them that was unsettling. "Maybe," he murmured, before returning to his sketches. Over the next few days, James continued to draw these impossible maps, each one more complex than the last. I noticed he spent increasingly longer periods in his room, the door slightly ajar as if inviting someone or something unseen. The air around us shifted subtly, like the first hint of a brewing storm. Despite the warmth of the season, I found myself pulling cardigans tighter around my shoulders, glancing over them as if shadows lurked just beyond my vision. Concerned, I brought up the subject with my husband, Mark, one evening. We sat together in the dim glow of the living room, the television murmuring softly in the background. "Do you think he might be lonely?" I asked, trying to articulate the unease that had been gnawing at me. Mark shrugged, his eyes never leaving the screen. "He's just a kid, exploring his imagination. I did the same at his age. I nodded, though my worries did not dissipate. There was something about the way James spoke of his hidden realms that felt too real, too palpable. One night, I was awoken by the sound of hushed whispers. The clock on the nightstand read 3:00 a.m., and a quick glance confirmed that Mark was still asleep beside me, breathing deeply. I strained my ears, trying to catch any familiar words, but the whispers were soft, merging with the sighing of the wind outside. They seemed to emanate from James's room. I hesitated momentarily before slipping out of bed, my bare feet silent against the cool wooden floor. As I approached his door, the whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. I knocked softly, crept the door open just enough to peer inside. James lay sleeping, his expression serene, though the notebook lay open beside him, pages filled with more of those detailed maps. A sudden wave of dizziness overcame me, and I had to grip the doorframe for support. The room felt heavy with an unseen presence, one that seemed to retreat as I stepped inside. I closed James's notebook and tucked it beneath his bed, hoping to quell the strange feelings that clung to me. As I made my way back to our room, the whispers resumed, faint but persistent, floating through the air like an intangible mist. The following day, I decided to keep a closer eye on James. After school, he went straight to his room, as was his routine. I pretended to busy myself with chores, all the while listening for any peculiar sounds. The house was unusually quiet, the silence punctuated only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the rustle of leaves outside. An hour passed when I was jolted by a sudden crash. I raced up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. James was standing in the hallway, his face pale and eyes wide with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Behind him, a framed photo had fallen, the glass shattered across the floor. "What happened?" I asked breathlessly. James looked at the broken photo, then at me. "He got mad," he whispered. "Who got mad?" James hesitated, his gaze darting to his room. "The man in the walls." The words hung between us, heavy and foreboding. My rational mind struggled to process them, to find a logical explanation. But logic seemed to wither in the face of such certainty. I spent the evening tidying up the broken glass and engaging James in activities to distract him. We played board games, had dinner, and watched a movie. Despite my efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edges of our perception. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake, straining to hear any disturbance. The house was silent, yet I felt a pervasive unease, as if the very air was charged with anticipation. When I finally drifted off, it was not to the comforting embrace of dreams, but a restless state where half-formed images danced behind my closed eyes. I awoke to find James standing at the foot of our bed, his silhouette outlined by the faint glow from the hallway. He seemed to be waiting for something. "James, what's wrong?" I asked, my voice thick with sleep. "I need to show you," he said softly. "Please come." His words were simple, yet carried a weight that brooked no argument. I glanced at Mark, who was still asleep, then nodded, slipping out of bed to follow my son. James led me through the darkened house, his small hand cool and steady in mine. We passed the living room, the kitchen, and finally stopped at the basement door. My heart skipped a beat. The basement was unfinished, a shadowy place filled with old furniture and forgotten memories. "Are you sure, sweetheart?" I asked hesitantly. James nodded, his expression inscrutable in the dim light. He opened the door, and a rush of cool, damp air met us. Together, we descended the creaky wooden steps, the surroundings swallowed by shadows. At the bottom, James paused, releasing my hand. He stepped forward, his fingers trailing along the wall until they stopped at a particular spot. I watched, mesmerized, as he pressed against it, the wall yielding with a soft groan. A section of it swung open, revealing a narrow passageway that sloped downward into darkness. "Where does it go?" I breathed, a mixture of awe and fear swirling within me. "To the other rooms," James whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Every rational part of me screamed to turn back, to wake Mark and leave the mystery for another day. Yet, the air thrummed with a sense of urgency, a pull that I could not resist. James had already started down the passage, and I followed, the oppressive darkness closing in around us. The passage twisted and turned, the walls damp and cool against my fingertips. We walked in silence, each step echoing into the void. An indeterminate amount of time passed before we emerged into a large chamber, the ceiling arched high above us. Faint light trickled in from an unseen source, casting ghostly shadows that danced across the floor. In the center of the room stood an old wooden chair, worn and frail, its presence both incongruous and ominous. James approached it with a familiarity that sent chills down my spine. He turned to look at me, his face partially obscured by the shadows. "This is where he stays," James said softly. "Who?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The man in the walls." A sense of vertigo washed over me, the room seeming to tilt and sway as if it were a living entity. The air was thick with an ancient mustiness, and a feeling of being watched prickled at the back of my neck. "James, we should go back. It's late," I managed to say, though my voice trembled with uncertainty. James nodded, his expression contemplative. "He won't hurt us. He just watches." The knowledge that my son had been communing with some unseen presence, one that existed beyond the boundaries of our understanding, was both terrifying and strangely reassuring. It was as if James had become the bridge between our world and another, one that remained hidden yet ever present. We retraced our steps, the passage seeming longer and darker on the return journey. As we emerged back into the basement, I felt a profound sense of relief, as if we had crossed an invisible threshold back to safety. The following days were a blur of normalcy tinged with the surreal. James was his usual self, though there was a newfound lightness in his demeanor, as if a long-held secret had finally been shared. I watched him with a mixture of love and apprehension, wondering how much of what we had experienced was real and how much a product of my imagination. But there were moments, fleeting yet undeniable, when I felt the presence of something unseen. A whisper in the night, a fleeting shadow in the corner of my eye, the soft creak of footsteps in the walls. They were subtle reminders that our world was not as solitary as it seemed, that the boundaries between reality and the unknown were more porous than we dared to believe. I never spoke of that night to Mark, nor did I press James for further revelations. Some secrets, I realized, were meant to be kept, to exist in the shadows between awareness and ignorance. And while the fear lingered, it was tempered by a strange sense of peace, an acceptance that our world was but one of many, each with its own mysteries waiting to be unveiled. And so, life went on. The maps disappeared, replaced by the usual childhood musings and schoolwork. Yet, every so often, I would catch James staring off into space, his eyes alight with a secret knowledge. In those moments, I would smile and hold him a little closer, knowing that even in the most ordinary of places, extraordinary things could find their way into our lives. There's a certain rhythm to life in the country, a gentle lull that cradles you into a sense of security. Our home, nestled in the rolling hills of rural New Hampshire, was a sanctuary, a place where the daily grind of the outside world felt a million miles away. My wife, Sarah, and I had moved there 5 years ago, hoping to offer our son, Ethan, a childhood that thrived under the open sky rather than confining walls. The house was an old colonial, worn but charming, with creaky wooden floors and a fireplace that crackled warmly during winter nights. Its basement was a cavernous, neglected space filled with forgotten remnants of previous owners. It was a source of fascination for Ethan, who often turned its dusty corners into fantasy realms with the company of his imaginary friend, Mr. Mapes. Mr. Mapes was a name that at first made us smile. When Ethan spoke of his adventures with this figment, it seemed a harmless outlet for his vivid imagination. He would describe them exploring jungles or sailing pirate ships, always with a child's innocent glee. It was typical childhood fodder, and we encouraged his creativity. The first disturbance came subtly, like a whisper in the night. One evening, as I tucked Ethan into bed, he looked at me with wide, serious eyes. "Mr. Mapes says there's something strange in the basement," he whispered. His voice was laced with an earnestness that caught me off guard. I chuckled softly, dismissing it as part of the game. "Don't worry, sport. There's nothing down there but old boxes and cobwebs," I assured him. He nodded, but the weight of his gaze lingered on me longer than usual. Over the next few days, the mention of Mr. Mapes became more frequent, his presence more palpable in Ethan's life. Our son, usually cheerful and playful, began to show signs of distraction. He would pause mid-play, listening intently, as if someone was whispering directly into his ear. At times, he'd stare into empty spaces with a look of intense concentration, as though deciphering a secret language. Sarah noticed it too. We discussed it one evening after Ethan had gone to bed, the concern etched in her voice. "Do you think it's normal for him to be so absorbed by his imaginary friend?" she asked. We both agreed that childhood imagination was a powerful and often consuming force. Yet something about Mr. Mapes felt different, more insistent. The escalation was gradual, a series of small events that began to gnaw at the edges of our sanity. It started with the noises, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but soon unmistakable. We would hear whispers echoing from the basement, a sibilant susurration that defied explanation. I checked the old pipes and the creaking beams for causes, but the house, despite its age, held no secrets to account for the sounds. Then came the dreams. Ethan began to talk about them during breakfast, intricate narratives involving Mr. Mapes leading him through strange landscapes, introducing him to shadowy figures that blended into the walls. His sleep was punctuated with restless tossing and muffled cries, his small frame shivering under the covers. When we asked about the dreams, his descriptions blurred the line between fantasy and an unsettling reality. One afternoon, while searching for some old camping gear, I decided to rummage through the basement. As I descended the stairs, a chill ran down my spine, the air thick with a damp, musty smell that clung to my skin. The dim light bulb cast elongated shadows that seemed to stretch and shift as I moved. I felt an inexplicable urge to turn back, but curiosity pushed me onward. Halfway through my search, I stumbled upon something peculiar, a small forgotten corner covered in a layer of dust and cobwebs. There, etched into the concrete floor, was a series of symbols, crude and childlike, yet unmistakably deliberate. My mind raced with questions. Who had drawn them, and why? I dismissed the thought that Ethan could be responsible, as the symbols bore a complexity that seemed beyond his years. I showed the etchings to Sarah, and together we decided to keep a closer watch on Ethan's interactions with his imaginary friend. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself listening intently to the whispers, trying to decipher a pattern or meaning. I felt the weight of something ancient and unseen pressing against the fabric of our reality. The climax arrived without warning, like a storm breaking suddenly over calm seas. It was a Sunday evening, the air outside thick with the promise of rain. Ethan had been uncharacteristically quiet all day, his attention absorbed by something we could not see. As night fell, he approached me with a seriousness that belied his years. "Mr. Mapes says it's time," he announced, his voice almost a monotone. A chill ran through me at his words. "Time for what, buddy?" I asked, keeping my tone light despite the growing unease. Ethan looked at me, his eyes reflecting a wisdom far beyond his age. "To open the door in the basement," he replied simply. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to mask my alarm. "What door, Ethan?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. He shrugged, as if the answer were obvious, and gestured downstairs. With a mixture of fear and determination, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I made my way to the basement, my footsteps echoing in the confined space. The symbols etched in the floor seemed to glow faintly, a trick of the light, I told myself. I scanned the walls for any sign of a door, my breath catching in my throat when I noticed a narrow seam in the concrete that I had never seen before. It looked like a door, tall and slender, blending seamlessly with the wall. I hesitated, the air around me thick with anticipation. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, yet Ethan's words echoed in my mind, pulling me inexorably forward. With trembling hands, I pressed against the seam, feeling the wall shudder and give way. The door swung open silently, revealing a darkness that seemed to devour the light. I stepped back, my mind reeling as I struggled to comprehend what lay beyond. It was as if I peered into a void, a place untouched by time or human presence. Whispers filled the air, louder now, a cacophony of voices that spoke of secrets and promises long forgotten. Just as I was about to retreat, Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs, his small figure silhouetted against the light from above. He looked down at me, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Mapes says it's okay," he called out, his voice carrying an assurance that belied the dread coiling in my stomach. I glanced back at the darkness, a turmoil of emotions warring within me. I knew then that this was a moment of choice, a crossroads between understanding and ignorance. But the whispers grew louder, compelling me to step forward into the unknown. In that instant, the air shifted, the basement filling with a presence that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. I felt it wrap around me, cold and unyielding, as if the shadows themselves had come alive. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone, leaving behind a silence so profound it was deafening. I staggered back, my mind struggling to process what had happened. The door stood ajar, the darkness within now still and impenetrable. Ethan watched me with calm eyes, as if everything was as it should be. The aftermath lingered in the days that followed, a shadow that refused to lift. The whispers ceased, leaving a hollow echo in their wake. The door, once opened, became an ordinary patch of wall, its secrets sealed away. Yet the feeling of unease persisted, a lingering fear that clung to the corners of our home. Ethan seemed unaffected by the events, his demeanor returning to that of a typical child, preoccupied with school and play. Yet his eyes held a depth that spoke of experiences beyond our comprehension. He no longer mentioned Mr. Mapes, as if the entity had served its purpose and vanished into the ether. Sarah and I decided to leave the past undisturbed, choosing not to speak of the incident. But I often found myself drawn to the basement, standing before the place where the door had been, listening for whispers that no longer came. The symbols on the floor remained a mystery, their origins and meaning locked away with the darkness we had faced. Life continued, the rhythms of our world slowly reasserting themselves. Yet beneath the veneer of normalcy, the memory of that night remained, a silent testament to the mysteries that lurk beyond our understanding. I often wondered what lay on the other side of that door, what truths Mr. Mapes had revealed to my son. In the quiet moments, when the house settled into its familiar creaks and groans, I would sometimes feel a presence, a reminder that the unknown is never far away. It was a comfort and a curse, a lingering fear that whispered of things unseen, and the knowledge that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. The sun poured its gentle rays over the neat rows of houses in the suburb, where every lawn seemed to tell a tale of meticulous care. The white picket fences framed a picture of idyllic family life, and the scent of fresh-cut grass wafted pleasantly in the air. Children played in the street, their laughter ringing out like a symphony of innocence, while parents exchanged pleasantries over their garden fences. In the midst of this mundane paradise, I found myself drawn into the rhythm of suburban life after moving into a modest but comfortable home. It was more than just a change of scenery. It was a chance to embrace normalcy after years of living a transient lifestyle. My wife, Claire, and I had been married for just over a decade, and our son, Ethan, was the apple of our eye. He was a bright, articulate 9-year-old with a penchant for puzzles and an imagination that seemed boundless. Our days fell into a comforting routine. Mornings were filled with the hustle of getting Ethan ready for school, and evenings were reserved for family dinners, where we would catch up on the minutiae of each other's days. On weekends, the three of us would explore nearby parks or attend neighborhood gatherings, which were frequent and welcoming. It was during one of these typical days that the first signs of disturbance made their presence known. It started subtly, as these things often do. Ethan had been spending more time alone in his room, a habit we initially attributed to his growing interest in reading and solitary games. Claire and I thought nothing of it, and even encouraged his independence. One evening, as I passed by Ethan's room, I heard him talking in hushed tones. At first, I assumed he was on the phone or had a friend over, but when I cracked the door open, he was alone. His back was turned to me, and he was sitting at his desk, engrossed in a conversation with what seemed to be thin air. Amused by his imagination, I didn't interrupt and quietly backed away, assuming he was merely indulging in a pretend play. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan's solitary conversations continued. Claire mentioned hearing him too, though she dismissed it as part of a child's creative play. Her reassurance did little to quell the growing unease in my mind. Ethan's demeanor had begun to shift subtly. There was a certain detachment in his gaze and an unsettling calmness that belied his age. During family dinners, Ethan's stories had taken on a darker tone. He spoke of shadows that danced on his walls at night and mentioned a friend who visited him when we were asleep. Claire and I exchanged concerned glances, but chalked it up to nightmares and the overactive imagination of a young child. The escalation was gradual, almost imperceptible, like a creeping vine that slowly chokes out the life of the host it clings to. One night, as I lay in bed, I was jolted awake by the sound of shattering glass. I rushed downstairs, heart pounding in my chest, to find Ethan standing barefoot amidst the shards of a broken window. His expression was one of eerie calm, eyes fixated on something beyond the shattered frame. "Ethan, what happened?" I demanded, my voice trembling with both fear and anger. He turned to me, his face devoid of remorse or explanation, and simply said, "It was him." When I pressed for more, he refused to elaborate, his eyes carrying a glint of something that chilled me to the bone. Claire, who had followed closely behind, took Ethan in her arms, murmuring soothing words while shooting me a look of bewilderment. We cleaned up the mess in silence, the incident casting a long shadow over the remainder of the night. The following days were marked by a palpable tension in our home. Ethan's friend became a recurring topic in our conversations, the details becoming more elaborate and sinister. He spoke of tasks this friend would assign, things that made no sense but were described with an unsettling clarity. When asked who this friend was, Ethan would simply shrug, saying, "He doesn't have a name." Claire and I sought advice from child psychologists, hoping to understand the nature of these manifestations. They assured us it was a phase, a harmless exploration of an imaginative mind. But my instincts told me otherwise. I felt an invisible presence watching us, lurking in the fringes of our home life, sowing discord in the shadows. One evening, as I returned from work later than usual, I found Claire sitting at the dining table, her face pale and drawn. She placed a hand on mine, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found something today," she said, sliding a small notebook across the table. It was Ethan's. The pages were filled with drawings, intricate and unnerving. They depicted figures standing in shadows, hands reaching out toward a smaller figure that trembled beneath their grasp. The scrawled words, "He watches, he waits," left a pit in my stomach. The climax came one stormy night, the wind howling through the eaves of the house like a chorus of lost souls. I awoke to find Ethan standing at the foot of our bed, his silhouette illuminated by flashes of lightning. In his hand, he clutched the notebook, and his eyes bore into mine with a disquieting intensity. "He wants you to leave," Ethan said, his voice carrying an authority that wasn't his own. "He says it's time." Fear surged through me, followed by a rush of anger. "Ethan, this has to stop," I exclaimed, sitting up in bed. But his expression remained unchanged, his words echoing in the room long after he had returned to his own. The storm raged on, and I found sleep impossible. I lay awake, thoughts swirling in turmoil, the sense of an unseen force pressing down upon me. Claire's breathing was steady beside me, a reminder of the normalcy I so desperately clung to, yet felt slipping away. Morning brought with it a deceptive calm. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean, but the tension in our home remained. I resolved to confront Ethan, to break through the barrier that had risen between us. But as I approached his room, I found it empty. His bed lay undisturbed, the window slightly ajar, curtains billowing inward with the breeze. Panic set in as we scoured the house, calling his name, our voices echoing in the empty spaces. Claire was frantic, tears streaming down her face, while I felt a cold, creeping fear that something had taken Ethan away. We found him in the backyard, standing in the early morning light, staring at a spot on the ground as if rooted there by some unseen force. As I approached, I saw what had captivated his attention, a circle of stones arranged with unsettling precision, in the center of which lay one of his toys, a soldier figurine, mutilated beyond recognition. "Ethan," I called softly, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned to me, eyes bright yet hollow. "He said it was a game," he replied, as if that was all the explanation the world needed. In the weeks that followed, we struggled to regain some semblance of normalcy. The event with the stones remained a forbidden topic, pushed into the periphery of our minds, though it lingered, a specter of fear that refused to dissipate. Ethan's behavior slowly returned to something resembling normal, the dark episodes becoming less frequent, but the memory of his words and the look in his eyes haunted me. The suburban idyll we had so eagerly embraced now felt like a facade, the cracks in its surface revealing a reality we had not anticipated. I often found myself watching Ethan closely, searching for any sign of the child who had once filled our lives with light. Yet, there was always a part of me that remained vigilant, waiting for the shadows to return, for the specter of his friend to rise again. And so we continued, living in the shadow of an unseen horror, our hearts burdened by a fear that lay just beneath the surface. It was a fear that whispered of things unseen, of the sociopath within who wore the face of innocence, and of the darkness that could dwell in the heart of even the most idyllic suburban home. The afternoon sun cast a gentle glow over our suburban neighborhood, each house nestled comfortably, like resting pieces on an immaculate chessboard. Our home, a modest two-story building with a big back garden for our new family, was the epitome of normalcy. The kind of place where dreams of family life materialized into reality. It was in this house that I intended to nurture the delicate threads of life around me, weaving them into a tapestry of love and warmth. Life had been quiet, the kind of quiet that allows your mind to wander into a hopeful future. My husband, Jack, and I had moved in nearly 2 years ago, expecting that our lives would soon be filled with the pitter-patter of tiny feet. Our wish was granted with the arrival of our son, Ethan. He was perfect in every conceivable way, a tiny bundle with bright eyes and a curious gaze that seemed to understand more than he should. At first, the days slipped by in a haze of diaper changes and lullabies. Nights were punctuated by Ethan's cries, demanding attention and the comfort only a mother could provide. It was exhausting but fulfilling, an experience shared by countless mothers before me. Yet, there was an unsettling feeling that I couldn't shake off. The first time I noticed something was off was on a typical Sunday afternoon. Jack was out mowing the lawn, his rhythmic movements visible from the nursery window. Ethan lay quietly in his crib, his eyes fixed on the rotating mobile above him. I had been folding laundry, humming a soft tune, when his laughter broke the silence. It wasn't the sweet coos of a contented baby, but a low, almost guttural chuckle that sent a chill down my spine. I paused, the laundry slipping from my hands, and turned towards the crib. Ethan stared back at me, his eyes gleaming with an intelligence far beyond his months. "Silly baby," I muttered to myself, dismissing the sensation that something was wrong. After all, babies often made strange sounds. It was normal, wasn't it? As weeks passed, the oddities increased with a frequency I could no longer ignore. Ethan's laughter, once sporadic, became a constant presence, echoing through the rooms, even when he was alone. The toys in his room seemed to move, ever so slightly, when I wasn't looking. I began to question myself, my sanity wavering like a fragile flame against the wind. Was this postpartum anxiety manifesting in strange ways, or was something truly amiss? Jack, ever the rationalist, brushed off my concerns with a reassuring smile. "Babies are weird, Anna," he'd say, pulling me into a comforting hug. "He's just discovering the world in his own way." But his words, soothing as they were meant to be, couldn't erase the growing unease in my heart. One evening, as we sat for dinner while Ethan slept, I brought up the idea of seeing a pediatric specialist. "Just to be sure," I suggested, my voice tinged with an anxiety I failed to mask. Jack looked at me, his fork pausing midair. "Do you really think that's necessary?" he asked, concern etching lines into his face. "He's healthy. The pediatrician said he's developing well." Perhaps it was a mother's intuition, or maybe just the overpowering need to protect my child. But I insisted. Reluctantly, Jack agreed, and the appointment was set for the following week. The night before the appointment, I awoke to a gentle creaking sound. I lay in bed, heart thudding in my chest, before I realized that the sound came from Ethan's room. Pushing aside the covers, I tiptoed down the hall, my bare feet silent against the wooden floor. The door to his nursery creaked open, revealing a scene that froze my blood. Ethan stood in his crib, his tiny hands gripping the wooden rails. His eyes, wide and dark, bore into mine with an intensity that seemed almost accusatory. The mobile above him rotated slowly, although the windows were firmly shut and the air was still. I took a hesitant step forward, compelled by a force beyond comprehension, and reached out to him. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. His gaze met mine, and for a moment, I was entrapped in an unfathomable connection. Then he smiled, a twisted, knowing grin that had no place on the face of an infant. I stumbled back, clutching the doorframe for support. It was a smile I had seen on an old, faded photograph of my great-uncle, whose life had been shrouded in mystery and unspoken family secrets. Something unfurled inside me, a realization that what resided in the crib was not entirely my son. The pediatric specialist found nothing unusual. "He's perfectly healthy," she assured us, her voice a balm to Jack, but not to me. "Babies can have peculiar behaviors. They grow out of it." I nodded, my lips curving into a facsimile of a smile, but inside, a storm raged. Days turned into nights, and the cycle of unease continued. Ethan's room became a sanctuary of dread. I could no longer bear to be in there alone, opting instead to keep his crib in our bedroom. Jack, sensing my distress, tried his best to help, but even he couldn't deny the chilling atmosphere that cloaked our home. One afternoon, while Jack was at work, I decided to clear my mind with a walk in the garden. The sky stretched endlessly above, a canvas of blue unmarred by clouds. As I strolled past the flower beds, I noticed something buried in the soil. Kneeling down, I brushed away the earth to reveal an old rusted key. Its presence was both foreign and familiar, as though it had always been there, waiting for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery was significant, an unspoken part of the puzzle. But how could a key connect to the eerie aura surrounding Ethan. My thoughts were interrupted by a soft cry from inside the house. Ethan had woken up. The weeks that followed were a descent into a waking nightmare. Ethan's behavior became increasingly sinister. Once, while feeding him, I glanced away for a moment and returned to find his spoon hovering midair, the puree untouched. Another time, I found him in his crib, quietly babbling to the shadowy corners of the room, his words forming an indecipherable language that chilled me to the core. Jack finally witnessed something inexplicable one evening as we settled in the living room. Ethan was in his playpen, gurgling happily, when the lights flickered. The room was momentarily plunged into darkness, and when the lights returned, Ethan was standing outside the playpen, his eyes fixed on us with an unnerving calmness. Jack's face drained of color. "How did he began, but the words died in his throat. For the first time, he shared my fear. We knew we couldn't ignore it any longer. A sense of urgency propelled us to act. We contacted a local priest, hoping that his presence might bring some much-needed clarity or comfort. Father Matthews was an elderly man, his face creased with wisdom and kindness. As he entered our home, he paused, his eyes narrowing with an unseen perception. The blessing was a quiet affair, marked by whispered prayers and the gentle sprinkling of holy water. Ethan slept through it all, his presence paradoxically peaceful. Yet, as Father Matthews concluded, he turned to us with a grim expression. "There is a heaviness here," he said, his voice steady but grave. "Something lingers, but I cannot say what." His words offered no solace, only deepening the mystery that had begun to consume our lives. I watched Ethan, his cherubic face serene in slumber, and wondered how such innocence could harbor something so sinister. As the days wore on, the atmosphere in the house grew oppressive. Jack and I found ourselves trapped in a cycle of fear and helplessness. The laughter that once filled our home was replaced by whispered arguments and anxious silences. Even the garden, once a place of refuge, seemed to pulse with an unseen force. The rusted key a constant reminder of unanswered questions. The climax came one stormy night. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as rain lashed against the glass. I lay in bed, unable to sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of Ethan, the key, and the unraveling threads of our once perfect life. A sound pierced the night, a soft melodic tune that floated through the air, drawing me from the edge of sleep. Sitting up, I realized it was the mobile in Ethan's room, spinning and playing its lullaby, despite being packed away days ago. Trembling, I crept down the hallway, my heart a wild drumbeat in my chest. As I pushed open the door, I saw Ethan standing in his crib, the mobile whirling above him in defiance of the laws of nature. His eyes met mine, and in that moment, I understood. This was not merely a haunting, it was Ethan, or rather, something within him, reaching out, seeking something. Driven by an unknown force, I fetched the rusted key from its hiding place and returned to the nursery. Ethan watched, an odd serenity on his face, as I held the key aloft, its weight heavy with unseen significance. I don't know what you want, I whispered, tears blurring my vision. But I can't let you have him. With a final, desperate plea, I placed the key on the floor between us. The air seemed to still, charged with anticipation, as if waiting for something to happen. Then, a gentle breeze swept through the room, and the key vanished, leaving behind only a whisper of its presence. Ethan's eyes fluttered closed, his breathing slow and steady. I scooped him into my arms, relief mingling with confusion and exhaustion. The storm outside subsided, leaving a profound silence in its wake. In the days that followed, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, leaving the house feeling lighter, almost normal. Ethan's laughter returned to its innocent cadence, and the inexplicable events ceased. Yet, the memory lingered, etched into my soul like a shadow that refuses to leave. Jack and I spoke little of that night, each content to let the past remain buried. But as I watched Ethan grow, I couldn't help but wonder if the darkness had truly left, or if it merely lay dormant, waiting for another moment when the past would cast its long shadow once more. And so, our lives continued, the semblance of normalcy restored. But in the quiet moments, when the world was still and the night crept in, the fear lingered, a reminder that even the most innocent of places can harbor the darkest of secrets.